document from February 1984, the month that Yuri Andropov had died. And it was from a U.S. diplomat in Moscow who had proposed facetiously to the State Department to send a cable to Moscow expressing appreciation for Andropov's many contributions to Western culture. And as he explained, it was because Andropov had driven out so many talented writers and performers and dancers and artists of various sorts. And the same could probably be said about Klement Gottwald and Antonín Novotný in Czechoslovakia, and later about Gustav Husak, that they had the effect of driving out some of the best academics, intellectual scientists, and others from Czechoslovakia. And so I am very pleased to welcome one of those emigres here today, Jacques Rupnik, who was born in what was then the capital of the unified Czechoslovak state, and but has long lived in France and has also spent considerable time in the United States. He is a professor at the I think at the Sorbonne, or maybe Sciences Po in Paris, and he had done his education between France and the United States, including a stint here at Harvard. He's also been a visiting scholar, a visiting professor at Harvard, so he's very familiar with the campus. And he has spoken here before on several occasions, that is for my program. And I am very pleased to welcome him back. He will be talking today about a strange personality, strange in the sense not about his personality per se, but a strange figure in Czechoslovakia who had started out in the Communist Party, Josef Guttmann, who had started out in the Communist Party, had to leave Czechoslovakia after the Nazi occupation, and he then worked for a long while in the West, but he never disclosed, and none of his colleagues ever surmised that he had been a Communist Party official in the 1930s. And so Jacques, doing research about this, was able to tie the whole story together for a book that has just come out, and he will be presenting it here today. So please, Jacques.
Well, thank you very much, Mark, for your introduction, for the invitation to speak here. I'm on sort of familiar ground because I spent 3 years here as a graduate student and have, as you said, returned regularly. It used to be called the Soviet Union program, and the place was called the Russian Research Center. This is just tells you how times have changed. But sometimes that remembrance of things past is useful even for contemporary purposes. I will try to show with the case of Josef Guttmann, because his life has neatly divided between Prague and New York. And you just alluded to the fact that here was this Marxist intellectual in the 1920s after the Bolshevik Revolution, and he made a meteoric rise within the Communist Party. So when the left-wing group makes a sort of takeover, he's part of the new leadership in 1928. Yet, and I had to cut the long story short because the book that you mentioned is not yet out. It was supposed to be. I was hoping that I could bring a copy. Stuff happens, publishers get delayed, and it will be beginning of June. Charles University together with Chicago. Anyway, too bad for the book, but the biographical profile has to be brief to get to the substance of what he had to contribute. I would not inflict on you just a story of biography, however interesting, because I think there is also what he had to contribute to certain important issues of the time. But the biography itself is a sort of mystery wrapped into an enigma, as Churchill said about Russia. Why? He has this itinerary in Czech politics, top of the, member of the Politburo, etc. But as soon as he gets there, he's very soon becomes critical and goes all the way to the split with the Communist Party over one important issue, which is Hitler's rise in German politics and Hitler's rise to power. But he starts before. In his clash with the Communist International, and he attends the meetings of the executive committee, is over the strategy that the Communist International had chosen, which is to consider social democracy as the prime obstacle to the revolutionary cause. So it's called social fascism. If you denounce social fascism, the workers will see the light, and they will see that they get ready for the final confrontation with the Nazis, and then nach dem Faschismus kommen wir. Then it's our turn. So he thought this policy of the worse the better is a catastrophic thing, not just for what used to be called the labor movement, for the socialist cause, but for Czechoslovakia, of course, for Central Europe, including for the Jews in that region. So he daringly criticized that. I cut a long story short. He gets finally to write a memorandum where he spells out all the reasons why he is in disagreement, and gets expelled, of course, as he must have anticipated very well himself. So that is the first thing. His main cause is the split with the Communist Party. He was a member of leadership over Hitler and what it meant for German politics, for Central European politics, for Czechoslovakia, for Europe, etc. So he had anticipated that. The second, from then on, he becomes a sort of dissident on the left. The word dissident was not yet used, but that's basically what he was. He was a splinter, and he was addressing the left, and he became a sort of, the leading critical voice on Stalin and Russia in that period in the 1930s, a crucial moment. There were a number of them, but the crucial moment were the Moscow trials, 36 to 38. As you know, there have been several of them. And he and his associate on editing a small paper wrote immediately after the trial of August 38, where you had leading members of the old Bolshevik Guard. They just saw the transcripts and wrote a devastating, analysis and critique with a number of ironical turns to it. And so that was the second thing. They compare it to what the Nazis did with the SA. You liquidate part of the leadership. So that, I think, on these two major issues, on Hitler coming to power and on Stalin and the way he had established total dictatorship, then that was Guttmann in Prague, so to speak. Perhaps I cannot resist temptation to quote from the, if I can find it, from this brochure that they published. I said dissident, but this was samizdat. It was published by his friend Kalandra, the co-author. So it was self-publication, so to speak. Great text, which is in the book. But they quote, of course, they cannot resist quoting Vyshinsky, a prosecutor. So he asks Kamenev, were you a bloodthirsty enemy of the Soviet Union? And he answers, yes, I was a bloodthirsty enemy of the Soviet Union. So obviously everybody burst out laughing. And they say, this is tragic, it's comic, it's absurd, and it's a judicial murder. Stalin is a murderer, and from then on, the discussion, basically for them, they are done with any idea that the Soviet Union can be reformed from within. From then on, it's a total dictatorship, and they abandon that idea. Unfortunately, I cannot go on more about what he did, what he had to say, but the influence remained very small. And after Munich in September 1938, he understood that the party was over, and at the end of October left Czechoslovakia through Denmark, Norway, and when the Nazis came to Norway, to Sweden on skis, as he wrote to his daughter, on skis to Sweden, and from Sweden, he says, there is one last boat that is going to leave. There's only one seat left. I do not have a ticket, and I do not have a visa. And still I got on that boat. And that's the kind of person he was. And on that boat, he got to Caracas and eventually to New York. But the reason I got hooked in the story is because I knew only the Czech part of the story, and it ended there. Why? Because the case of Guttmann was revealed, let's say revealed, publicly discussed by historians in Czechoslovakia in 1968 during the Prague Spring. And a very interesting article had been written by a Czech historian, Hradilák. And when I was a graduate student here, I wrote a paper about that. And because there was no East European studies at Harvard at the time, I emphasize that, because my grudge, as you can see, remains very strong. It was Russian Research Center, it was Soviet Union program, and there was no, so I had to cross-register to MIT to Professor William Griffiths, who you probably know, Radio Free Europe and all that. He was very interesting. Anyway, I wrote this paper about Guttmann based on Czech historiography of the 60s. And he said, this is great stuff, you must get it published, which I did. And returned to Paris, and I showed the article to a Czech exile. I was told, the person who would be interested is this man, Veltrusky, himself an associate of the Prague structuralist group from the linguistic circle from the 1930s, friend of Jakobson, etc., etc. And he said, I will read it and let you know, because I asked him what happened to him. He wouldn't tell me. He said, I'll read it and let you know. At our next meeting, he had a thing. And so I said, what happened to Guttmann? And he pulled out of his briefcase a book entitled The Jews in the Soviet Satellites, edited by Peter Mayer. I said, that's him. So suddenly there was a second, another person appearing on the scene. And I asked my former professors, Adam Ulam, Richard Pipes, about did they know about that? And they said, well, we knew Peter Mayer. I mean, we read his articles in the various journals in the 50s about the Soviet Union, about the Cold War, and all that. But no, we didn't have a clue that what was his background. So this is what got me started. There are the Czech historians for whom the dissident on the left, if you want, that story ends in 1939. And then there are my American professors who knew his stuff from the 50s, but didn't have a clue about his Czech past, because it was under a different name. So you have two lives under two names, but of course, a common thread, which is Stalin, Hitler, and what happened to Europe and to Central Europe in particular in that period, you could say between 1933 and 1956. That's roughly the period where Guttmann is interesting. He dies in 1956, and incidentally, his last article is about the 20th Congress of the Soviet Communist Party. So it very neatly closes, and unfortunately prematurely, because one wishes he could. He was still young. He could have. I wish he could have seen the Prague Spring, not to mention 1989, but the Prague Spring would have been I think something formidable to have his take on that. Anyway, so these are the two lives, and what I think, what I can, you must tell me.
You got plenty.
I must not go on for too long. But what I think is interesting. I mean, there's the biography, the two lives, etc. That in itself is interesting, but I will not go into that. What is interesting is the meeting, for me, the meeting between people like Guttmann, intellectuals from Central Europe, from Prague, from Vienna, from Germany, etc., who at the end of 30s and during the war come to United States, preferably to New York. And then in New York, meet with, New York being the headquarters of, let's say, American intellectual life at the time. No offense to anybody else, but the place where the intellectual and the political life around the key journals, Partisan Review and the New Leader and Commentary and Politics, etc. You had there a milieu which blended. Actually, a number of those intellectuals, New Yorkers, were themselves, 2 generations back, with a connection to Eastern Europe as well. So it all, and that encounter of the Central European intellectuals with the New Yorkers in this crucial period between the war and the Cold War produced intellectually some of the most interesting exchanges, concepts, debates, which really framed the debate through the terms in which they, and to some extent we, understand that period. And again, I cannot do justice to all of it, but I would simply take 3 issues that I think where the contribution was interesting. One was about totalitarianism, of course, that was connected to the birth of the concept of totalitarianism. So that is one major theme. The second is genocide. 1945 that's a time, and Guttmann writes and has made very interesting contribution to that. And the third one is the question of Russia and empire, and how should the Western democracies respond to it, which is also an interesting topic. It was then, of course, a crucially important topic, but in some ways it is still an interesting topic for today. All of these themes have their contemporary echoes. So if I start with the first one, definition of what is the Soviet Union. So I said that from 1936, they considered, okay, Russia is a total dictatorship. They couldn't, Guttmann could not accept just of Trotsky's, because the key figure in those debates in the 30s was Trotsky, and the revolution betrayed the idea that, the revolution had been sort of hijacked or betrayed, and that what you need is to reverse that course. And so Guttmann writes in 1944 in a journal called Politics, edited by Dwight MacDonald. And he himself, Dwight MacDonald, was a splinter from Partisan Review. Anyway, I must not get into New York intellectual history, because there are some interesting books published about that recently. In the recent period. Neil Jumonville has published a very interesting book. What is her name? Frances Stoner Saunders has written a book about the cultural wars during the Cold War. And she had as a subtitle, "And the Role of the CIA in it," etc. Anyway, there were several books. Louis Menand at Harvard here has produced a book about that period. Anyway, so I must not get into the American side too deeply, but this is Guttmann. Two-part article, long essay, very detailed, very thorough. Not the first, but probably one of the most interesting in the way he turned Marxist categories against a regime that claims to have monopoly on Marxism. So the idea that it's a new class regime. It's a new class. There's a state property of the means of production, but since they own the state, so to speak, collectively, they are the new ruling class, which he considers worse than capitalism, because in a Western capitalist society, workers can organize, they can bargain for their wages, they have means of expression of their discontent. In that regime, they have none of that. The Gulag is the other option. So it is basically a new form of class domination, worse than capitalism. And he then has a second, and I should add, of course, this is not, he wrote that published that in 1944. There is a debate going on in America, in American left, among those intellectuals, Schachtman, Burnham, etc. It starts around 1939, what is it, Burnham's managerial collectivism, etc., etc. The number of books that are moving away, all this group in New York, actually, you could call them post-Trotskyist group, because a number of them had at least a brief encounter with Trotskyism. And so this is it. They move away from the idea that you can change the Soviet Union from within. They no longer want to call it socialist, so you're trying for a new way to address it. And Guttmann, therefore, fits in that debate. And Köstler, for instance, has a book about Soviet Union. He quotes Guttmann more often than any other author. And anyway, so this is one aspect. It is a new form of totalitarian rule. If we have time later, perhaps I will say something of what his understanding was. That basically, in one line, is that you cannot have socialism without democracy. That democracy is not, as he said, some ornament you put on a kind of socialist structure. No, it's the essence. It's an extension of the democratic process. So it can be that's his understanding at the time, and it evolves as well over the years. The other interesting insight is that he considers at the end of the war that totalitarianism is over in Germany, has been vanquished, but totalitarianism is expanding elsewhere. That was not an obvious proposition at the time. I'm talking about immediately at the end of the war. Then during the Cold War, of course, that became more frequent. If I can, I might be able to trace the quote. Yeah. One of the features of the Nazi regime is that all opposition, liquidation of all the opposition. And then Russia is another case in point, which, albeit different, had been characterized by the disappearance of organized opposition after the Moscow trial. So he considers Russia already fits a totalitarian political system. And very interestingly, he says, totalitarian terror did not disappear with the fall of the Nazis. Unfortunately, much of the world is still in the grip of totalitarian dictatorships. So He then considers that totalitarianism exists in Russia, and the second, that totalitarianism is now being extended to Eastern Europe. And we are talking about the immediate after the war. I mean, there's one article which is called The Limits of Terror, written in 1946, when he considers that Eastern Europe itself, including Czechoslovakia. So he says, in some countries, a totalitarian regime is not yet perfected, and legal opposition still exists. But the days of such opposition seem numbered. So in other words, in 1946, this is one of the reasons why he didn't return to Czechoslovakia after the war. You may ask why. Well, he had anticipated that wherever the Soviet Union would be, I mean, whichever territory they would liberate from the Nazis, they would establish their regime. And this is, so in 46, he anticipates that in Czechoslovakia, at the very moment where you had a coalition, many people think, there is a possibility for a third way, all sorts of things like that. He considers already they are on a slippery slope. Then the days of that democracy are numbered. So that's the second point. He anticipates what's going to happen in Eastern Europe. And a third point, resistance to totalitarianism is possible, even under extreme forms of oppression. Why does he say so? Because he had studied the archives of Belarus and Russia. This is made available at the Nuremberg trial, under the Nazis, under Nazi terror. And he, on the basis of that, concludes something that, again, I think is a profound insight, is that resistance is possible. Again, I must not inflict too many quotes. Yeah, you got the main point. What is interesting here, Harvard, 1953, you have the big conference on totalitarianism, Friedrich and Brzezinski, and, if I recall from my student, there were 15 criteria, 15 points, Friedrich and Brzezinski, which characterize a totalitarian regime, et cetera, et cetera. And there was one sort of dissenting voice, slightly dissenting voice, which said, yes, it's, and that was Karl Deutsch, another of my teachers here, half a century ago. But he was also from Prague. And his contribution to that volume, published by Harvard University Press, is, I think, entitled Cracks in Totalitarianism. Or basically the idea, which is what Guttmann also believed, that totalitarianism can never be total. That there is a society, there is a culture, there are forms of resistance that are possible on a very limited scale, but that can develop. And of course, as you can imagine, this is an argument that has significance for later developments. And you can take it all the way to Havel, but then Havel makes the argument about post-totalitarian. So it's no longer different, it's already a different type of regime from the one Guttmann has been describing. So I think that that is an interesting insight. It's totalitarian. It's going to extend to Eastern Europe, and resistance is possible even under these most extreme situations. The second contribution concerns the concept of genocide. So we are in 1945. The concept for the first time is being established. Some of you may be familiar with the book by Philip Sands, East-West Street. In French, they call it the Retour à Lemberg. So, and why is Lemberg important? Because you have two lawyers. They both come from Lemberg, Lvov, today called Lviv. And they both had the same teacher in law school. And they both, in 1945, formulated two concepts that became very extremely influential in the context of the Nuremberg trial, because that's where things have been named, or at least there's been an attempt to name what has happened. And one, Lauterpacht, insists on crimes against humanity. And this is a concept that prevails, that is dominant. Lemkin, the other, is fighting for the concept of genocide. You know, people who are murdered not because of what they did, but because of who they are. And so he didn't manage to get it in the main text, but he managed to squeeze it in one of the parts. Anyway, this is the subject of the book. Guttmann is very early on this subject of genocide because he writes for YIVO. He becomes a researcher attached to American Jewish Committee, and he writes in the YIVO letter these contributions about situation of Jews in Eastern Europe. So he's very during the war already, and immediately after the war, he's onto this. And in what way is he, of course, different, or what is his contribution? Because other peoples have written about that. One contribution is he asks, where does it come from? What are the antecedents of what we have just seen with the Holocaust? And he goes to the Armenian genocide, and he writes a study of the Armenian genocide, and has uses that quote that Goebbels says to Hitler in 1939, who still remembers the Armenian, etc. So he goes that he makes a very thorough analysis of them, and the Armenians are so grateful for that because nobody's talking about the Armenians at the time. Is that in 1965 they republish his study in a volume dedicated to the subject. So he looks at the antecedent, examines carefully what genocide meant in Central Europe. I mean, again, you are familiar with the subject. I must not. Well, if we have time, I have the figures. Perhaps I cannot. I mean, Poland. There were 3 million Jews in 1946. The figure was 200,000. Today there are 5,000. Hungary, there were 825,000 of Jews, of which 600,000 were deported and exterminated in 1944-45. Today, there are some 100,000 Jews in Hungary, mainly in Budapest. Czechoslovakia counted 315,000 Jews before the war. Only 10% survived. 77,000 died in the Protectorate. Today, there are 15,000 of citizens of Jewish. Anyway, I must not. So he is analyzing what the situation meant in Central Europe. And so he's saying, Armenian antecedent, today, Holocaust. And at the end of the study says, Armenians yesterday, the Jews today, and who tomorrow? So he's already raising the question that with the end of the war and with the defeat of Nazism, the question doesn't end. It may return in different form. Who's next, so to speak, is his question. And he himself is asked to testify in at a UN commission on the question of genocide. So I thought that is interesting. His take, I mean, his contribution to the question of genocide. It's not just simply that he studied particular circumstances, but there's a reflection there about the phenomenon before and that it doesn't end with the Holocaust. Then there is the whole question of anti-Semitism. I don't have time to develop that here, but a big subject, a big theme in his writing in that period is the question of anti-Semitism. And he edits this volume, The Jews in the Soviet Satellites, published in 1953. And he also publishes a number of articles on that subject. Perhaps the most significant, I would say, is the one concerning the Slansky trial in Czechoslovakia in November 1952. So you must imagine the situation. He, former member of the Politburo, right? This is a group that came into power in the Communist Party in 1928. In 1948, they took the power in Czechoslovakia, not in the party, but in the state. The same group. But the group is put on trial. The Secretary General himself, Rudolf Slansky, is accused of being an imperialist agent, a Zionist agent, a traitor, etc. I mean, all of them. 11 out of 14 will be executed. And it's a totally unbridled, in French we would say déchaîné, a totally unbridled, without any restriction, anti-Semitic trial. It doesn't pretend. So this is, all the confessions start with, why did you do this? Why did you betray your country? Why did you become an agent, etc.? Well, to answer your question, I must say I am from bourgeois origin, and I'm from a Jewish family. We never quite belonged to the Czech nation, etc., etc., etc. So it's the confession. It's 20 years. It's 15 years after the trials that Guttmann had analyzed in the Soviet Union. You see the group making the confession. And so there are two things. First of all, you cannot help thinking if he had stayed in the party, he would have been there too, of course, and he knew that. And he was, of course, the first to analyze what it meant. So the trial was at the end of November. Even during the trial and immediately after, he writes first memos for the American Jewish Committee. And in December, he writes the article, which is published at the beginning of January in Commentary. So it's instant. And what does he have? He has the only source he has is radio broadcast, because the communists were broadcasting the trial. They were so proud of their unbridled anti-Semitism that they broadcast it. And what was published in the party paper. They published the confessions of the accused. Based on those two things, he wrote what is, a thorough, very deep insight into what this trial is, what it means, etc. There have been more thorough studies now published on the basis of archived material, etc., but not a better analysis of it. So that piece stands as it is. That piece in Commentary, but also then he has an extended version as a chapter in the book that I mentioned. So you have anti-Semitism, and he writes about that. He has an article in Commentary entitled "Stalin Walks in Hitler's Footsteps," and it's about anti-Semitism. So you thought anti-Semitism was over. No, we have a powerful new version, this time coming not from the West, but from the East. And the question then he asks is, how do you explain that anti-Semitism survives in Eastern Europe after the Holocaust? You would have thought, including the figures that I gave, no, but it is there so he suggests a number of reasons. One, there is partly the historical background, and of course, the further east you go, the more the anti-Semitic element is powerful. Obviously, Russia, Ukraine, Poland. Less so in Czechoslovakia, which makes it paradoxical. Why do the most outrageously anti-Semitic trial in the country where anti-Semitism was in relative terms much, much weaker than, say, in Poland or Romania or Hungary? There is a book actually published by Harvard University Press about Judeo-Bolshevism, and that is a second, what's called Hannenbrick. The name will come back to me. It was published about 3 or 4 years ago by Harvard University Press about the myth of Judeo-Bolshevism. So you say basically, where does it come and how is it being used? And Guttmann addresses that how come it can work. So he said it works some countries suddenly because there is I'm simplifying the argument, a disproportionate number of Jews in the communist leadership of those countries, because the Communist Party is recruited often in the minorities, let's say in Poland or in Hungary or in Romania, etc., etc. So that is part of the argument, but he doesn't dwell on that. He also considers as a factor the failure of the communist economic policies in the post-war era. You know, the regime is in difficulty, and you look for scapegoats. So we think this is one of the reasons. You blame it on so and so. They took over. They were in the leadership. They mismanaged, and they are therefore responsible. And he has as one important element in trying to explain why anti-Semitism is being revived after the Holocaust. And he says, and that is the restitution policy, because there was a policy after the war that, people whose property had been confiscated by the Germans, etc., that they could reclaim it. And many Jews didn't return from the camps, but those who returned, or those who stayed in the country hidden and reclaim their property, and that was very unpopular, particularly in Slovakia. So he gives elements from Slovakia. Oh, you returned. Well, your house is already in somebody else's hands, and so he says that is a factor. And how do the communists cope with it? They have an argument for this. He says, well, the Jews, why would the Jews want restitution? Since we are in the process of building socialism, we're going to nationalize everything. That is the future. And so he has this quote that I cannot help citing here, is that the best way to overcome anti-Semitism is basically to overcome class differences. So he says, the best way to emancipate the Jews is to expropriate them. There will not be any class differences. They will be like everybody else, and therefore there will not be. If this is your explanation why you have anti-Semitism, that you have class differences, well, there you are. So he doesn't lack a sense of humor as well. And final reason that he only mentions, he doesn't develop, but I think, at least for my money, this is one of the important reasons, is the reversal of Stalin's policy about the Middle East. Because in 1948, the Soviet Union, as you know, and all these Europeans, including Czechoslovakia, backed the creation of the State of Israel. Czechoslovakia was a big supplier of weapons in the fight for establishing that state. And when Stalin changes his policy domestically with a doctor's plot and things like that, he goes, but he mainly, in his policy in the Middle East, he tries to wean the nationalist Arabs. And he tries to justify his pro-Israel policy by saying, well, this was a terrible mistake, so to speak, for which the communists, the Jewish communists are responsible. And that's why we put them on trial. They confess that they have been Zionist agents. And okay, so it's part of the Stalin's foreign policy turn as well. Anyway, there are a number of reasons, therefore, that are given to this. Are we finishing at 5:30? Is that
no?
We still have, okay. So I will be briefer on the third question, which is Guttmann, Russia, Soviet Union as an empire, and how should democracies respond to the threat. This is I remember there was a book when I was in the 1980s by Alain Besançon, a well-known historian of Russia. He'd written a book called Passé russe et présent soviétique. Russian past, Soviet present. That was in the 1980s. Today you could switch it. You say, Russian present, Soviet past, and Russian present. Okay, so this is basically the question, and Guttmann is already addressing in his way. He reads a book of lectures by George Kennan, which are published then in 1950. I think the publication is 54. He writes about it in 1955, 54, 55. And he already addresses this question and has a slightly different take from Kennan. Basically, the fact that you can use elements of the Russian past doesn't mean that the new Soviet expansion is not of a different nature. It doesn't have also another different driving force, and that is related to its totalitarian nature, and that is related to the threat it poses to democracies. And therefore, he then asks. I already mentioned that his last article is about the 20th Congress of the Soviet Communist Party. Unfortunately, this is an article where he didn't know yet about the secret speech. So he's going on the basis of the speeches that are made available, but not the secret speech. However, even in that, he detects that in speeches by several of the leading communists, Khrushchev actually doesn't seem to him the most interesting or the most revealing in the official speech that has been published. But basically, he already sees that, okay, we are talking about denunciation of crimes. Well, then the question is, who are the criminals? Because there cannot be only one. So who are the criminals? And therefore, we have to address this broader question. But he understands that once you breach that taboo, if you say that the greatest genius of mankind is actually a criminal, well, you've opened something which has far-reaching consequences because of the very specific nature of the communist system of belief, of the communist ideology, to which I will actually get in a moment. So he has and addressing the question, how should democracies respond to Soviet expansionism and to the threat it poses to Western democracies? Well, by being vigilant about both, about the threat and about remaining democracies. You can resist a threat to democracy only if you remain vigilant about democracy itself. That's why when he talks about the McCarthy's, we are in the 50s, the McCarthy's period. So he says there are two types of paranoia. There are those who seek reds under the bed everywhere, and then there is the other lot who consider that any attempt to confront actual threats by a totalitarian force, political movement or whatever, they consider it a fascist threat. So he said, these are the two forms of paranoia. Reds under the bed, and fascism is creeping if you raise the issue. He is part in New York of the American branch of the Congress for Cultural Freedom. I don't know how many of you you probably are familiar with the fact that a Congress for Cultural Freedom had met in Berlin, had its then secretariat in Paris, and you had a number of leading intellectuals from all over Europe, Raymond Aron, Camus, Czeslaw Miłosz, the long list of very eminent European intellectuals, but also a number of very eminent American intellectuals. I already mentioned Sidney Hook, and Arthur Schlesinger was the head of the American branch of that committee. And, Guttmann got engaged in discussion. I mean, there are letters where he draws attention to Schlesinger, or does suggest he has a different reading on certain things from Schlesinger. And the big debate, is about the nature of the communist threat and how to oppose it. And of course, once it's the Congress for Cultural Freedom, you are opposing on the, let's say, intellectual, ideological front. You're confronting the communists on a certain level. Guttmann, not just, mainly through his article, he was a believer in two things. You want to challenge the influence of the Soviet ideology or the communist ideology in Western democracies, address the primarily the non-communist left. The left for him is interesting, not just because, so to speak, the right on the right, it's easier to win the argument. And how do you win the argument? Is not by exhortation and declarations or whatever. No, facts, analysis, thorough analysis based on facts. And he is, of course, incredibly erudite. He reads all the languages. I mean, you see his article on, on Soviet economies, read everything, all the economies. He has a great Marxist culture, reads German, of course, French, etc. He believes in facts and he believes in testimonies. So he realizes he says the best testimonies. One of the French anarchists who in the early 20s went to the Soviet Union, settled there and stayed 15 years in the Soviet Union. And when he returns, he writes a devastating piece about, a testimony about that. And this man, he says this is the best. And then he has a similar praise for Kravchenko after the war. He believes very much, once they establish the facts and testimonies by people who lived through that and who know what we're talking about. And that is very important. I said Kessler is quoting him very often, and that was the similar approach. I mean, Kessler said, we defending half truth against total lie. And yeah, that would be more or less Guttmann's position as well. And if I had to give another definition of what he stood for, Partisan Review did a survey of, this is yours, did a survey of New York intellectuals, how they would define their attitude towards socialism or Marxism and things like that. And Sidney Hook answers something. I mean, I'm quoting from memory. First of all, I'm a Democrat. I'm a socialist. And you could say that I am a Marxist in a way that a modern day biologist could say I'm inheritor of the Darwinian tradition or something like that. So he would consider that's what Sidney Hook gave as a self-definition. I forgot in 1947 or so. And that would more or less fit Guttmann in the immediate post-war period. And he gradually, as Cold War was getting nastier, as the anti-Semitic, unbridled anti-Semitic, his position became harder and harder in the opposition. I mean, I could give examples which I want now. Perhaps I will conclude by saying, talking of testimonies, there was Whittaker Chambers, whom you remember, Pumpkin Papers, Al Juhais, and that, the Committee on American Activists. And Whittaker Chambers had written a book then on how to confront the communist threat or something like that. Okay. And I found Guttmann's handwritten comment on it, on which I can read you an excerpt, which I have also in handwritten form, which is perhaps unfortunate because I will have to read my own handwriting, which is a major achievement. Yeah, this is what Guttmann writes, quoting at first Chambers. Without doubt, the fanaticism, the devotion, the readiness to sacrifice of believing communists are derived to a great deal from the religious character of their faith. And then he adds, another blend of fanaticism, another brand of fanaticism is necessary to oppose to them. And so you have one kind of fanaticism, and yes, communism, and this is what Guttmann says, is like a secular religion. And others, Raymond Aron and others, have of course written about that. And so Chambers says, you have to oppose it. And he himself, suddenly became very religious and thought only religious stand can stop it. Well, Guttmann has a different take. And he writes, here again, Chambers is mistaken. Throughout history, people have lived and died for fanatical faith. But there are also those who lived and who were ready to die for the freedom to think and to talk, for tolerance, for kindness, for happiness of fellow men on this earth. Their heroism was compatible with true humility, which admittedly is the possibility, which admits the possibility that they may be mistaken. So, and perhaps I will end there, exactly the opposite of Chambers. The enlightened humanism, the possibility, admitting the possibility that you may be mistaken. That is what Guttmann thinks is the best way to oppose the communist fanaticism.
Okay, thank you. Let me, before I turn to the audience for questions, let me ask one that I am still not clear on, because I've looked at the page proofs of your book, so I have an advantage over other people here. For someone who was so engaged in intellectual debate after the war, or even a little bit before, with 1944 and the like, and wasn't trying to hide anything really about his own views. How could he not? How could his past in the 1930s not have been known to many people? I mean, as you pointed out, there were quite a few others who were involved in some of these debates who had origins in East Central Europe, and they didn't have a mysterious past per se. There were many of them who disavowed their past, especially if they had been avid communists. But so how was it that in 1968, when historians involved, I think Willem Fretchen was one of them, and others, but who were involved in looking at Guttmann, how could they not have known what he then went on to do in the West?
Well, first of all, he was not ever hiding here that he was a communist. He was simply silent about it. Even I'm sure that if somebody asked, he confronted him. But if you ask him about the Czechs, how come they did not know? How could they know? He came to America, became American citizen, changed his name. He adopted his second wife's name, Gordon. So he became Gordon, and was writing under yet another name, which is Peter Mayer. Well, for somebody sitting in Prague in the 1960s without possibility of coming here, without accessing, I don't know,
the internet.
Yeah, internet. Yeah, the connection was not was not very good. Skype was not functioning well. Anyway, it was difficult. So they did not know. However, there were people who did know, and that was the Secret Service. The Secret Service traced him here. They established where he lived in New York after the war. And this is where the story becomes absolutely amazing, because you have two things. In 1947, I'm just giving you the gems from the, I read the Czech police records. Incidentally, Czech police records from before the war are, I would say, matter of fact. They would say, Guttmann and his friend Calandra, they organized a meeting about, I don't know, the Spanish Civil War, or about the Austrian events of February 1934, etc., etc. There were, 87 people in the audience. Guttmann said this, so-and-so asked this. It was factual. Maybe at the end you had some kind of evaluation. Nothing. You look at the police record after the war. This is people with very wild imagination, because you have their correspondent, if I dare use that term, establishing that Guttmann is in New York. Ah, great. They establish that he has become American citizen. Yes, okay, we are onto something. And then he says, it becomes very likely that Guttmann, now that he's American citizen, will be sent to Prague to work at the American embassy as a head of the ideological department. the thought that, first of all, that there is an ideological department at the American, I suppose propaganda department would be, yeah. I don't know. But the thought that Guttmann, who had just become American citizen, would immediately be sent as an American diplomat in Prague. And the argument is that is very likely, that makes a lot of sense, because given that he has this connection from his past to people in the high circles in this country, would make him a very effective agent, so to speak, here. So first extravagant proposition. Here is Guttmann, who doesn't even dare return to Czechoslovakia at the end of the war, where everybody else returned. I mean, not everybody, but Roman Jakobson didn't want to return. I mean, they had both the same analysis about what's going to happen in Eastern Europe after the war. So that's one extravagant proposition. That's the intelligence service. I mean, the guy had one too many drinks in a bar in New York and just, used his imagination, something like that. Then you have a second thing. This is no longer this was 47, okay. They have another report, 1956. Spring 1956. We have news. We have information, they don't say news, we have information that Guttmann is actually penetrated the territory of Czechoslovakia. Oh yeah? This is a top guy in the, and we urge immediately that search is being carried, that, etc. You have an urge to accelerate the search all the way to the city of Tábor, because he was born in Tábor, his family came from there. So at the beginning of May, on 2nd of May, you have a message from the head of the police office saying, we have news he's here. It's most likely he would want to go, that he may find himself in Tábor or in the region. We ask you immediately to report where he is and what you have. Response from the regional police office. Yes, we are immediately starting the search. So far, we haven't been able to establish his whereabouts, but we are onto it. And as soon as we have news about Guttmann's activities here, we will report. This was 5 days before his death in New York of a heart attack. I mean, you know, when people use, and this is just making a broader point. I mean, all this is extravagant. Both the foreign intelligence, their agent in America reporting that he's coming to, and the domestic police, he's in the country. Where is he? Find him, etc. That is a warning to all those who, and there are many, who think that what they find in police archive, communist police archives, secret service archive, what have you, in Czechoslovakia, in the communist country, that is evidence. Oh, his name appears here. He has done this. Oh, he appears in the files of the Secret Service. And, you know, the police files became a big industry, as you know, for instance, in the Czech Republic, but in all the countries of it. I would say this made me think, before you take this for granted, what you read in secret police files and intelligence files or what have you, you may think twice before you scream and before you start publishing or denouncing people. Anyway, parenthèse refermée, close. Yeah, the police archives make very interesting reading. The Czech historians did not know. The Secret Service did know, but completely misjudged. And then domestic police was out to lunch. You know, this is it.
Okay. Well, in any case, I will pursue this if there's enough time, but let me turn to the audience for a question.
Sorry, I didn't mean to undermine.
Well,
Face it, archive. I know I touched the raw nerve there.
No.
Because there's the greatest expert is sitting next to me.
I'm just wondering, you know, particularly for Guttmann, and looking at you know, this very ugly anti-Semitism that developed in the last several years of Stalin's life, but that it was also being spread to countries of Eastern Europe, including Czechoslovakia, as you pointed out, which was probably the country where it was most lurid. That you know, that his participation in, particularly in writing about anti-Semitism and so forth, must have been seen by the state security in Czechoslovakia as maybe, I'm not sure how to put it, but as basically turning him into someone that they wanted to neutralize. Now, that could be done by assassination, as was done in several cases, particularly Bandera in 1958, or it could be done simply through efforts to discredit him. So I'm wondering, when you were looking through the state security files and you saw things, did you find documents that you think were planted there to discredit him? Or?
There was certainly, they considered him a threat. What I found extravagant, here is this immigrant. He doesn't have, you know, he wrote to his daughter at the end of the war, you know, that he was doing odd jobs. He had worked for one research institute for surveying economic situation in Eastern Europe. Then he worked for broadcasting, CBS broadcasting to Czechoslovakia. But that was disconnected in '47. He did odd jobs. He worked on Ruth Benedict, the famous anthropologist who was in Columbia. He worked on a research project for her as a research assistant. He was looking for odd jobs. Eventually, he ended up with a job at the American Jewish Committee. But I think what is clear from the communist files, that they considered him a threat still. This is for me extravagant. A guy who is in New York, he doesn't have any meaning. He is doing odd jobs. Finally, he writes, of course, you know, and then of course about their their regime, about Slansky trial, etc. They cannot help in every file, when you open the file, they always start with the biography. Here is Guttmann. He's a former member of the party leadership who became a Trotskyist, traitor, agent, etc. That's how it starts. It's incidentally, even there they make mistakes. So, so that is the first thing. He was there, and he was one of us, so to speak, and he became a traitor and a Trotskyist traitor, and therefore very dangerous. So that's how he established. And then you say, well, he's in America, and therefore all the more dangerous, since this is a center of imperialism, etc., etc., etc. Yeah, they attach I would say disproportionate importance to what he can do, because all he can do is right. So that was more or less what he did. What I quoted about, he's going to be sent to the American embassy. He's in the country. This is their paranoia. But it stems from the fact that he was all the way up in the leadership at one point.
Okay, John.
This is a fascinating story. Thank you. Could you say a little bit more about where you see Peter Mayer using the experience of Josef Guttmann? Like, how did his experience being up at the top of the Politburo is that reflected in his analyses in the 50s? And I assume he keeps that part secret. He doesn't ever.
Oh no, he doesn't. He doesn't talk about that. But certainly it shaped his insight.
What kind is it? Just about the treacherousness and hypocrisy of?
Yeah. Well, for instance, as a member of the Politburo of the Czechoslovak Communist Party, he was also attending the members of the executive of the Communist International in Moscow. So you see how he got the understanding of how it works. Who is important enough? Who has a different opinion? Who is being silenced? So very early understood how the Communist International works. And incidentally, when he is expressing criticism in 1932, before he wrote the memorandum, but he's already overtly criticizing the German Communist Party, friendly advice to German comrades, as he said. I have some friendly advice for German comrades, stop calling them social fascists. And you know how the communists, how Moscow responds? They invite him to take position at the Communist International in Moscow. There he understands perfectly what this is about. Very early on. So this is his insight. You don't need to be a weatherman to know from where the wind is blowing. He knows exactly what that means. Come to Moscow, and we will sort you out. And so from there, very early on, he understands what kind of regime, who is it, and so the difficulty, you are first from within, you're trying to challenge from within, but your experience from the Communist International shows you that you will get nowhere. And well, then he embarks on a very classical route of the dissident from the left. Maybe the idea is good, and maybe the revolution can still be corrected or something. You still believe something like that is possible. And then in America, you fall into another category, and that's the God that failed. If you know the book, that Richard Crossman edited, you have these leading intellectuals, Ignazio Silone, Gide, and many others. Many. I mean, there's maybe a dozen contributions. How, the process of belief and disillusionment, disbelief, emancipation from that belief. And this is why the final quote I gave is important. He says, you know, Chambers wants to oppose fanatical belief with fanatical belief, or with religious belief. And what is interesting about the book, The God That Failed, and Guttmann in a way belongs to that group, is this process of disenchantment. But that is disenchantment, and you can say, well, this is not something terribly original with Guttmann. Your question is, has his experience in party leadership? Yeah, I would say yes. And that gave him an extra, you know, when he writes about the Slansky trial, only he could have written that piece because he knew them all, he knew how it worked, and he had all figured out from the Moscow trials in 1936 to 38. And he had the first intuition of that in 1932 when he expresses disagreement. And he says, they don't want to expel him. He said, no, come to Moscow. It's supposed to be a promotion. You know, one-way ticket guaranteed.
Please. Then here, Nina, please.
I had a question, like a reverse question to the communist secret police files. And about Guttmann here in New York was to what extent was he monitored here by, you know, the local US agencies? Because just thinking of, let's say, Boscovets, when Boscovets came, he was stuck in Ellis Island for 8 months, investigated for his prior activities in Czechoslovakia with great suspicion. So, you know, I wonder how much, and of course, Guttmann didn't come from Czechoslovakia right away, and from that kind of interwar moment, but was he still suspicious enough here for the CIA and
FBI?
FBI. Well, I don't want to get too much. Of course, as you can imagine, I looked at the Czech police files and I wanted to have the American. I wanted his FBI file. I wanted his naturalization file. I filed under the Freedom of Information Act. I tried all sorts of things to no avail. We are sorry, the file cannot be found, has been misplaced. And obviously the reason I went for naturalization file, because when you apply for naturalization, you have to fill your biography. So I wanted to at least to hear, to read his version of his biography. There's no doubt that the American authorities knew exactly who he was. And when he became American citizen, I am sure. I wouldn't want to speculate about why he did not have, why the file has disappeared, or why no file is available, why no trace is available. I have even, asked people at the American embassy in Paris or in Prague if they can help. All of this failed. So there is something there.
But not to comment on the specific case.
Sorry.
Not to comment on that specific case, but if you were to lose a file, what would be a logical concern of the FBI? Why would they be making that file lost?
It means simply the file is not available to you because we have reasons, or we have promised never to reveal it, or whatever. Yeah, I don't know. Your guess would be as good as mine. I cannot really then that goes in speculation. But yeah, it is strange that none of these files, none of these traces, and I tried very hard. I really went. I did the utmost. When I mentioned it to a lawyer friend, he said, "Sue them. That's the only way to get it."
Which you can't.
Well, here is a professor from Paris who was suing the FBI. Come on, I mean, I'm scared already at just having said that. So, so yeah, this is
Don't worry, Jacques, I've sued the FBI several
You did?
times. Yeah, successful.
You're still doing fine.
Yeah, well, on FOIA grounds.
Okay, maybe you will sue it on my behalf.
Please.
Okay, thank you. So New York in the 1940s and 50s, the 1960s was also a center of Russian emigre, intellectual, anti-communist, anti-Stalinist, anti-totalitarian socialist left. Like Kerensky, Chvedze, socialist revolutionaries, Mensheviks, who were very active. In 1949, they founded something called the Liga Borьбы за свободу народов, and were publishing actively in Novy Journal, especially, which was founded in 1940 or 41. So the question is, was Guttmann in touch with these other, with, for example, these very active and these Russian emigres too, in New York?
Yeah.
You know, you talked about the American,
Right.
the American left, or about the Russians.
Yeah, well, first of all, he was strongly connected to the Central European emigres.
Right.
You know, he arrived in America the same year as Hannah Arendt, whom he knew, who he met. There was a Sunday meetings at Karl Wittfogel. Wittfogel was a well-known professor originally from Germany. I seem to remember he also had a brief communist past, but he is the author of Oriental Despotism. So we are talking about a period when people think about totalitarianism, that book on Orientals. Anyway, Wittfogel, these are German speakers, Germans, Austrians, and some people like Guttmann, who preferred their company to the company of the Czechs in a way. He spent more time, it seems, with them. So that is one group. Then he writes, probably most articles he's written was for the New Leader, which was edited by Levitas, who was a Russian Menshevik that left the Soviet Union in 1924. Came to this country and established a journal, which was really, I mean, Sidney Hook, I think in his memoir says this was the most, he says this was the most influential journal of the time. Okay, you know, the competition was tough. So I don't know whether that judgment's there, but yeah. So people like Levitas, obviously. So Russian Mensheviks, Levitas was a Menshevik. So you have this group that they were the Mensheviks, left the Soviet Union, came to New York, and some of them, as you say, were publishing Russian periodicals. Levitas went to create an American journal for which he recruited Guttmann. So I have seen, I mean, he had a perfect knowledge of Russian. He read all the Russian sources, and obviously he must have known others. I mean, I'm mentioning Levitas because that's the most obvious of his Russian contacts. The problem is, I could never get his personal correspondence, because when I wrote my initial paper at Harvard, that was you know, more than half a century ago, and when I then find out that he had an American, you know, the second part of his life, and there was still his widow, Olga Gordon, who lived in New York, in Queens, and you know, so I got her number, and this was a terrible mistake. I called her, and I said, you know, here I am. I'm Rupnik calling you. You know, I'm a graduate student at Harvard, and I'm calling you from Cambridge because I'm writing about the Czechoslovak Communist Party. I'm writing my PhD, and your husband was a member of the Politburo of the Communist Party. So I would be very interested to see his correspondence and his archive. There was a long silence. And I said, you know, hello, and she said, no, I have nothing. No, please forget about this. Hang up. So I called, not immediately, but a couple of days after, I tried again. I said, listen, I'm only, I'm writing a PhD. I would not use anything without your permission. You will decide what I could use and from his correspondence, etc. And then she was more relaxed. She said, yes, I understand your interest, but you know, I really don't have anything that would be of great interest to you, etc. Then we corresponded a bit. I always try to persuade her, and her answers were getting shorter and shorter. So yeah, no, I messed up that day really in a bad way. Well, you know, I was a graduate, a mere student, and when I said that to a friend, who was then head tutor in social studies where I was teaching, he said, "You must have scared her." And I said, well, why would I scare her? He said, well, you know, you start bring back the communist past, etc. You know, but I said, this is all history. He says, for you, for her, it's yesterday. Anyway, so this is how I didn't get his private correspondence. Then I couldn't get his FBI file. Then his naturalization file. No, on the American side, it was difficult. I got a lot of things. For the Czech side, you know, I had abandoned that story long ago. It was his daughter. When I published the history of a Communist Party in Prague, which I didn't do immediately after the 89, because I thought, you know, Czech historians, young Czech historians would rush into the archive. I didn't have access to the archive. So they would go to the archive and write something, you know, better, more profound, better documented, I don't know. And so I turned down an offer, which I had in 1990. 10 years after, you know, the same publisher calls me and says, well, they still haven't published anything. I still want your book. I said, okay, but you'll have it as it stands. I'm not updating, correcting, or anything. And I published it. And the book was published. About 2 years after the book is published, I received a letter saying, Mr. Rupnik, you have dedicated your book about the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia to Josef Guttmann. I am his daughter. Can we meet? And so, okay, so she got me back into this. So, and not immediately, but then I was, you know, providing her with his text. She said, but what he was doing, what was he publishing? So I had gone, in those days, you didn't have Google and all these search engines. I had to go through all the copies of commentary, New Reader and all that, big Xerox, etc. And I would make always copy for her. I would give her at each of our meetings, and she would be that way, yeah, reconnected with her father, and she would be telling me about their lives in the 1920s and 30s in Prague.
We've reached the final time, but Nikolai, did you have a question? Okay, so let me then thank Jacques for an excellent presentation. And also thank all the members of the audience and of the Davis Center staff. So the book will be out, as Jacques mentioned, in June. I thought it was already out.
Well,
because it says on the page proofs that it'd be out in April. But okay, so I encourage everyone to get a hold of it, and I will see what I can do by way